Hi, my name is Jule Krüger. I'm a program manager for Big Data and Data Science in the Center for Political Studies at the Institute for Social Research, and with Advanced Research Computing, a division of Information Technology Services at the University of Michigan. The title of my presentation today is Reproducible Data Processing: Strategies to Make Your Research Auditable, Scalable, and Reproducible. The goal of principal data processing is to process your research data in a way that is self-documenting. So the goal here is to minimize active time that you spend on documenting your work. The goal is also to make it so it can scale. So this could mean that you would want to include multiple data sources, collaborators, project years, and so forth. It also is to facilitate updates in an automatic way. So this means that as your input, your source code, or your constants change, updates to your analysis can be automated. And it also facilitates auditability and reproducibility. So this means that your research data and work are accessible for yourself and for others and their review. I want to give you an overview of the data processing principles I'm covering today, and then I'm going to talk about each one in more detail. The first principle is conceptualizing your project as tasks, then organizing your project directory by task, separating input data from source code, manual work, and outputs, using makefiles to document targets and dependencies, separating manually set constants from your code, applying self-explanatory naming conventions, and version controlling your work and publishing a public repository. Let's talk about breaking your data science project into tasks. Assume that every research data project that we do follows some type of workflow, and this is very specific to what you're trying to do, but I'm going to give you an example here of what such a research data workflow could look like in terms of the tasks that it might follow. So for example, first, we might be busy importing some data in some shape or form. This might be simply reading some files that we already have, or maybe it involves scraping data or running API requests. Then we might be busy cleaning this data so we can prepare it for analysis. We might run an analysis, so we may be analyzing, or in this case, let's say, once we have the data clean, we want to estimate. Then in this case, in this example workflow, we might want to apply the estimates. So we're going to use the estimated data points and then apply those to some kind of model. And then we want to visualize our results so we can share them with the public or in a paper and so forth. So this is an example research data workflow, and the project you're working on might look different, but in general, we can talk about these 5 tasks. Now, what we want to do next in the second principle is we want to organize our project directory along these tasks. So what this might look like is that as you build your project directory, you intentionally try to represent this workflow of the research tasks that are manipulating and processing your research data. And so you will dedicate a specific directory for each one of these tasks within your project directory. The research data workflow that I just gave you as an example, you can see here that within my project directory, I have directories that are called import, clean, estimate, apply estimates, and visualize. Next, what we want to do is for each task, we also want to separate the different parts that make up the task. So in this case, we want to separate our input data from our source code, from the work that we do manually, and from the output files that we are creating in this task. What we're going to do is for each task in its own directory, we're going to create more directories within that task directory. So one directory we can call source, for example, SRC, and that is where we will put all of our code scripts. So these can be your R files or your Python files and any other source scripts that you may be using to process your data. Then we're also going to create a directory that's called input, and that is where we can put all the data that are going to be processed. So these files are going to be read from the source directory, and they're going to be in that input directory, such as CSV files or TXT files or JSON files, whatever types of data files you're working with. And so there might not be an input directory in every task, and I'm going to show you in a moment why that may be. But in general, that's where you would want to put raw input data that you're reading from. Another directory would be the hand directory. And this would be specifically to designate that these are all files that are related to manually created work. So these might be training data where you have labeled some records to then use in a machine learning model. These could be constants or maps or dictionaries, any type of values that you're generating manually instead of in some automated fashion. And finally, there's the output directory. So that is specifically for writing all the output files that are being generated from your code and source. So these could be processed data or your results coming in forms of graphs or estimates, tables, reports, and so forth. So let's look at an example data flow of what that would look like. So imagine you have your research project that you have given some names. So here it's an example of my research project name. And then you create a directory in there that's called import. And then you have your input folder, and there you put your raw data txt file. And then you have a source directory that has a file called read rawdata.r, an output directory that contains the imported data.csv. So that's the process data that was generated from source. And then we have another directory called clean, and that contains some mapping values in a hand directory, a clean imported data.r script in a source directory, and an output directory that contains the clean data.csv. And so your data would be flowing in this way. So you have your import source would be reading from input, and it would output the imported data into a CSV file and output. And then your clean imported data.r file and clean source would be reading from output imported data.csv in import. It would also be reading from the mapping values in clean hand to then create the clean data.csv and clean output. Another principle that we can adopt when we're processing research data is writing a makefile for each task. Make is a utility that helps you run and compile code from the command line. And so we can use makefiles to compile all the code that is stored in the source directory in a given task. What's good about writing makefile scripts is that they clearly identify the dependencies. So those are the code scripts, input files, and the manual work files that you have generated. So these are in your input, source, and hand folders. And they also clearly identify the targets. So all the files that are going to be stored into your output directories. And so what that does is, as you write your makefile, you're actually self-documenting your workflow. So you're clearly identifying these are the files that I'm using to generate these types of outputs. So as you're self-documenting, you don't have to actively describe what you're doing in a task, but anytime you and others can come to your makefile in a given task directory and just read what was happening. And then what Make does, it observes the timestamps of all the dependencies to determine when it's time to rerun and update a target. And so this facilitates automation. And you can also combine Make with a library that can parse the arguments for the different dependencies and output files into your code scripts. So for example, the argparse library is very helpful for that. And it's really useful because you track all the file names that are relevant for a project exclusively in the Make file. And I'm going to show you an example of what that looks like. Let's look at an example Make file for a data cleaning task. So if you were going to your clean directory in your project, you would store a Make file right in that directory to designate all the work that's happening in that task. And then you would have your clean imported data.r script and source, and you would write some clean data into your output directory. And this is what an example Makefile for this clean task, what it could look like. Your goal is to write the mycleandata.csv file to output. You are designating your target. In line 8, we're saying that in output, the mycleandata.csv is what we're trying to generate here. And then you're starting to describe your dependencies. So you're saying there is a code file, my R script, clean imported data.r and source. There are also the data that we wrote to import output, where we imported the data from some txt files. My dependency is also my Makefile. So if any of these 3 files are getting updated, then I want to rerun this task. And then we're just telling Make that we will rerun this R script, and we will use our 2 arguments here. So one is the input file. So that's the import output imported data.csv to generate the output file, which is our target. So the output mycleandata.csv. Simply by looking at this Makefile as it sits in your clean task, it will be very clear what's happening in this project and what were the dependencies on which your target, the clean data, rely. Another principle in reproducible data processing is separating constants from your code. In this case, what do I mean by constants? When I talk about constants, I mean parameters that do not change within one version of the analysis. These can be identified, for example, in YAML code or in CSV files, in dictionaries, or another format of your choice. You can also use specific libraries to read some of those files. So for example, YAML files can be read into R using the YAML library, or in Python, the PyYAML library. And you can put all these constants into your hand directory to identify their manual work nature. You can, for example, think of constants as parameters that you set for a specific model. So these can be statistical parameters that are required by some statistical model, or those could be mappings of specific values. So for example, if you had certain zip codes, you could identify what are the names for the counties that these zip codes belong to. So these would all be kind of constant values because they do not necessarily change over time, or maybe if you chose to update your analysis and change your analysis in some way, you would tune the parameters for a statistical model, but then they would stay constant within that part of the analysis. Every time one of your constants would change in the hand directory, then you would be updating the files in that directory. And if your Makefile is designated to read those files in hand as dependencies, then you would also be able to update your results as you update your constants. So let me show you an example of a constants file that is written in YAML code. Just as a reminder, if we were in our clean task, we would have our Makefile, and then in hand, we would, for example, put a constants.yaml file. We would have our clean imported data in our source directory. We would want to write the clean data into the output directory. Here's an example of a constants.yaml file. For example, one constant in your project could be when the project is supposed to start and when it's supposed to end. So for example, here we could assume a project of 6 months that runs from January 1st in 2021 until June 30th in 2021. Now I'm going to show you an example of how you can bind your Makefile with your R code using argparse and a constants.yaml file. Assume you had a Makefile for your clean task. You wanted to generate a clean version of your data, and you designate your dependencies. So you're using the R script that's cleaning the imported data. You're using the imported data from import output. You have a constants file that is designated in YAML code, and you have your Makefile. And then you want to parse those arguments into your following code. And here's again, as a reminder, the constants file. So we have a constants file where we designate the project start and end dates for our analysis. Here on the right side is the R code. What we can do in our clean import data R script, we can import the argparse library and the YAML library. And then we will have a small section where we are going to designate our argument parser. What we do here is we designate that there is an input file argument, a constants argument, and an output file argument. And we're storing these names into an arguments object. If you look on the left side here in our Makefile, we are designating that the input file refers to import output imported data.csv. The constants file lives in hand constants.yaml, and the output file refers to the target that we're trying to generate. What's nice about this is that we can actually keep track of all the file names that are relevant to this particular source script in the Makefile. So we don't have to change them in the R script if we were ever deciding to rename some of the files that we're using, or if we're going to add or remove. And then we would simply update the argument parser section up here in the top of the R script. Then we're using the YAML library to read in the constants. So we're able to load that YAML file into constants and create a little list of all the different values designated constants. Then we're going to simply read in our data from the spreadsheet that we have written into import output. What we're doing here too is we're formatting the date variable, so we have a proper date format. And then we can already proceed to subsetting the data to our desired period of observation. What you can see here is that we're taking the data and we're subsetting it where we're only picking values that are either coming the day of or after our project start date, and only observations that have a date leading up to or at the date of our project end date. And then we can write that subset, that observation period data to another spreadsheet. And that's what we're going to write into the output file, arguments output file, as we have designated it in the Makefile. What you can see here is all these different principles in practice, because what you can do is if you wanted to, for example, change the project date of your observation, let's say you wanted to add 2 more months because you have collected more data, you could simply in one spot change the value in your constants file and set a different date variable for your project end date. You wouldn't have to bury it and find it deep in your code, but you would just set these parameters in hand and then quickly update your scripts, because as soon as you change the constants, then if you were to rerun and call for make, then it would know that it had to rerun the make file because your constants had been updated. Another principle that helps is adopting self-explanatory naming conventions. For example, as we have already done with the directories, when we're trying to create directories, we will call them for the tasks or the data that they contain. So we'll say import, clean, write, or hand, or input. Data files can also get the names of what they contain. Here I'm saying data raw.txt or data clean.csv, but you might want to be even more self-explanatory. If you had, for example, data about employees, you might want to call it employees raw.txt or employees clean.csv. Code scripts, you could call them for what they do. So for example, if they read raw data, or if they clean imported data, or if they plot days per month.r, you could call them that. And again, you could be even more specific. You could say read raw employee data or clean imported employee data, for example. Likewise, if you generate objects in your code or variables, variable names, it's really useful for yourself and others who read your code to call them what they are. So you could call, for example, your subset the observation period, or your time period subset, or days and months if you aggregated your data in these ways. As you write functions, it would be very useful to call them for what they do. So instead of, for example, saying my function 1 or my function 2, you could call them clean raw data or plot days per month, for example. And again, if you had constants, you could also call them for what they are, such as your project start date and your project end date. And then the final principle that I'm going to talk about today is version controlling all of your work. For version control, you could use, for example, Git or Subversion SVN. And what you can do here is you can really commit small increments often. So you're logging the iterations of your work. And then as you go back, it will generate a log of everything that was done in your project. So you're also accomplishing some self-documentation here. And you're, of course, always able to revert back in time anytime you need to. And then finally, if you're ready to publish, you could publish your project directory to a hosting platform of your choice, such as GitHub or GitLab or Bitbucket. You might want to prefer a cleaned up copy that doesn't have the logs. So you could publish a clean branch of your project, for example. To summarize the benefits of principled data processing that I just talked about here, on the one hand, they provide transparency about how you set up your project and how you manipulated the data. They quickly convey the role of each project file based on its name and also where it is located in the project directory. They clearly distinguish between computational and manual work, which makes both accessible to project unrelated individuals. And they also enable a sensitivity analysis of modeling parameters and coding decisions. Combined, these practices facilitate peer review and reproducibility. If you're interested, you can check out an example project directory on my GitHub site. It's github.com/julek. The project directory is called jpr-lvm-svac. This directory shares replication data, code, and supplementary information for a joint research project with Ragnhild Nordås who's an assistant professor in the Department for Political Science at the University of Michigan. I will also make sure that the link to his project is put in the description below for the video. Thank you so much for your attention. Bye.